Good morning. Thank you all for coming out and braving the Washington Capitol's parade traffic, which will intensify a little bit later this morning. I'm Darrell West, Vice President of Government Studies and Director of the Center for Technology Innovation here at the Brookings Institution. And we would like to welcome you to our 9th annual A. Alfred Taubman Policy Forum. And we are webcasting this event live, so we'd like to welcome all of our viewers from around the country and around the world. And we have set up a Twitter hashtag, AI Era, if you wish to post comments during the forum. That's AI Era. So Al Taubman was a good friend and a strong supporter of our program. He passed away 3 years ago at the wonderful age of 91. So I want to thank him and his family for their generous support. His children, Gail, Bobby, and Bill, are not able to be with us today, but they send their best wishes. And we are certainly grateful for all of the support that they have provided us over the years. Al Taubman was a forward-looking individual. He always had great insights into new trends and important developments. I always learned many things from my conversations with him. So we thought it would be fitting to devote this year's conference to the opportunities and challenges of artificial intelligence. This is a topic of great importance because AI is the transformative technology of our era. It already has been deployed in a wide variety of sectors, from healthcare, transportation, and education to defense and national security. It is altering how we operate in many different areas. I have a new book out entitled The Future of Work, Robots, AI, and Automation that looks at the impact on the workforce, and it is available in the Brookings bookstore right outside the auditorium. This morning, we have a dozen different experts drawn from government, business, and academia. They will present their thoughts on AI and suggestions on ways to move forward. I think the central question we're going to be addressing throughout the morning is how do we get the benefits of AI without incurring the downside. To moderate the first panel, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Brookings President John Allen. John not only is the leader of this institution, he is a serious subject expert on artificial intelligence and other types of emerging technologies. He has deep knowledge about many different aspects of AI and the issues that it raises for society and governance. So I can think of no one better equipped to launch our conversation. So please join me in welcoming John Allen and his panel of experts.
Great. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to have you here with us on this wonderful day dedicated to the capitals. Thought briefly it would be about artificial intelligence, but it's actually about the capitals. As Darrell makes an introduction like that, I always recognize that there is a difference between artificial intelligence and natural ignorance. So what I'm trying to do this morning is to set the case for this panel to help us all to understand about the use of artificial intelligence to promote security. We have about 55 minutes for this panel. I want to welcome the audience that's in here today, but also welcome all of us, all those who are coming into us today by the webcast. And you're always welcome to join us, and we're very grateful that you're with us today. Today, the panel is, we have several folks joining us on the panel today: James Baker, Susan Hennessy, and Scott Tousley. James is currently a visiting fellow here at Brookings, Jim, where he writes on issues related to artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and national security. He comes to us after a long and illustrious career with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, having most notably served as the Bureau's general counsel for 4 years. And he's also a lecturer at Harvard Law School, where we're very lucky to have him joining us from time to time. And frankly, Jim, thank you very much for making the choice to come to Brookings.
Thank you.
Next is Susan. Susan Hennessy is a Brookings Fellow with our Governance Study Program, as well as the executive editor of our excellent blog, Lawfare. Similar to James, Susan focuses on national security issues surrounding cybersecurity and surveillance, as well as federal terrorism prosecutions and congressional oversight of the intelligence community. And prior to joining Brookings, Susan was an attorney in the Office of the General Counsel of the National Security Agency, NSA. And finally, we're joined, and we're very fortunate to have with us this morning, Scott Tousley, who is the Deputy Director of the Cybersecurity Division of the Homeland Security Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Directorate. In his capacity at DHS, Scott supports several initiatives in critical infrastructure protection and cyber physical systems, as well as project leadership for efforts such as computer security incident response and other similar projects within DHS. Scott served for 20 years in the United States Army as an officer in the Corps of Engineers, spending much of his time doing the important things that engineers like to do. We talked about that before. It's a wonderful community, and congratulations and thank you for your service with the engineers. So we'll talk for a few minutes. I have some questions to ask the panel, this panel of experts, and we'll come out to the audience about halfway through the hour. So let's talk first and foremost about the tactical to the strategic. AI has the capacity to drastically impact virtually every aspect of our national security as a concept, but also in the apparatus. Let me just ask each one of the members of the panel, from your perspective, how will AI most change the way we think about national security? Jim, could we start with you?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. So in terms of how AI will most drastically change things with respect to national security, I think we don't really know, and I think that's one of the things that concerns me the most. It seems to be a very powerful technology, so the answer is we really don't know, I think. In terms of sort of thinking about my background and the kinds of things I've worked on, counterintelligence, surveillance, cybersecurity, I think in those fields it could substantially revolutionize how we approach those types of issues, how we approach data, how we understand and analyze data, and how we then deploy investigative resources as a result of that. So what do I mean by that? For example, one thing I think that we have to think about, and I'm not quite sure that I'm sure that we're not quite ready to deal with this, is in terms of using AI, for example, to understand and analyze the investigative holdings, for example, that the FBI and other agencies have, to utilize AI tools to look at and look for patterns, with patterns, relationships, within what it is that we have already. We have a lot, speaking of the FBI still in the present, the FBI has a lot of investigative holdings from a variety of different sources, including from electronic surveillance. And I think utilizing AI to understand and analyze that potentially could have huge benefits for us, but it raises a number of privacy, mainly, I think, privacy and issues with respect to the Constitution, and making sure that what's done is in a strict adherence to the Constitution and laws of the United States. So I think that's an area that would be, I think, highly significant for us, and I think we need to give a lot of thought to that. I think the lawyers need to spend a lot of time thinking about that, and happy to chat about that more as we go here.
And I think that's a hot burner issue, frankly, for us these days. Scott, any of your thoughts, please?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the chance to be here. My boss, Doug Maughan, got called away, so I'm sort of stepping in here for him. And I also want to give a shout out to Mike Harris, who I work with at NIST and in a lot of these areas and stuff, another serious expert in this space. We don't know exactly how it will play out, but it's pretty obvious it will have significant, huge impacts in multiple different areas. You know, we've seen a lot of cases already over the last decade, especially the back and the forth of offensive techniques of cyber activity versus defensive, and it's pretty clear AI can help both ends of that, which is both good and bad. It's a double-edged sword, like so many of these technologies and technical capabilities and concepts and explorations turn out to be. This is maybe one of the most significant breakthrough areas that's taking place in a globalized world where lots of money is going into this that is not in the United States. And that gets really interesting because it's not just our social science, policy, legal questions getting folded into the tech capabilities. It's also different experiments being done, Germany, South Korea, Australia, Russia, China, you name it. And so everybody's experimenting with it in a social way, not just a technical way. And so we've got to be really attuned to what's being experimented, tried out, piloted, and that's a topic that's pretty significant to me in a science and tech organization, where we've got to think of this in an engineering, let's try some things way, not because we've settled the policy, but in a lot of cases you have to park the policy while you explore to see what even makes sense to do it. And we're naturally pretty good at engineering things and trying stuff out. It's harder to convince people that when there's people involved and there's policy and legal and all sorts of other issues involved, that you still have to try the same experimentation.
Sure.
But it's clearly going to have a big impact in lots of different areas.
Thank you. Thank you. Susan?
Yeah, so I largely agree, right, that this is all a double-edged sword. There's going to be good and bad. Sort of on the positive side, I think it does have the ability to sort of revolutionize speed, capacity, the ability to detect patterns, not just sort of augmenting human capacity, but really going beyond what we ever could have possibly imagined. It's also going to introduce entirely new forms of vulnerabilities. And we're going to have to think not just about sort of the promise of AI and machine learning, but also sort of what's known as adversarial machine learning. So deploying these systems when there is an attacker or sort of in the presence of somebody who wants to manipulate them for bad. So Don Song, who's a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, has done some really interesting and rather scary research, if anybody out there wants to get their pulse racing in the morning, on what this sort of adversarial machine learning might look like. So some of her experiments have shown, for example, how easy it would be to modify a stop sign such that for a human who was looking at a stop sign, it would look like an ordinary stop sign. To an autonomous vehicle system, it would actually become entirely invisible. So whenever we start to think about the ability to manipulate objects in the physical world in ways that can have really, really dramatic consequences, I think that's a sort of a little taste of the kinds of security challenges that we're going to be facing here, that not only are we moving deeper and deeper sort of into the cyberspace, but we also need to care about the kinetic world as well.
Very good. Now, Scott, you spend a good bit of time in the whole business of cybersecurity. And we know that, as Susan properly said, and I think it's a very important point to recognize, the speed at which things will occur will be revolutionary. In fact, you'll hear the term now hyperwar in the context of how fast conflict can both unfold and be prosecuted. But there's also a real implication for that in the context of the cyber domain and protecting and acting in the cyber domain in terms of cybersecurity. Can you give us some of your thoughts on that, please?
We fund a lot of applied research efforts trying to improve capabilities that CIOs and CISOs have within DHS, the federal world generally, and the critical infrastructure world. And it's common already for elements of AI to be folded into something that somebody's doing that may actually serve to protect an emergency call center or protect against a DDoS attack or all sorts of other things. So the AI elements are percolating into the applications, the use, the explorations in lots of different areas, and that's going to obviously continue. I think the other interesting thing is that we're only still partway through the really large mashup of historically information technology things with the unfolding operating technology changes across the different infrastructures, Internet of Things applications, the pervasive censoring of everything everywhere. And so AI is really just the analytics and the insight, while everybody is still trying to understand. A decade ago, I was trained on how to manage a water plant by managing things that were there, and now you can almost autonomously do it, and figuring out how to do that in a safe and secure way, ways that the insurance companies are happy with, all those sorts of things. And so AI is really just a significant layering of learning and application on how to do that. And that is the one thing I think that helps us a little bit, is that all of our systems are so heterogeneous that that gives us a little bit of a break or a governor on the AI stuff that helps us, keep an eye on where it's going to go and how it's going to help us manage things in the right ways.
Good, thank you. And are there other panels?
Sure. Yeah. In terms of cybersecurity, I agree with that. It presents a lot of different novel challenges. It strikes me that, first of all, AI, to think about AI, at least from a perspective of a lawyer, right? So keep in mind I'm not a technologist, but when I think about it, I think about it as part of the much larger digital ecosystem. So it doesn't exist on its own somewhere out there, right? It exists on technology. It exists on computers, and the faster, the better, I think, at least in terms of how it is able to operate. And it also then, as we've sort of touched on, it helps analyze data in ways that we've been chatting about, but it also, I'll use the term, feeds off of data, right? It learns from data. It needs to be exposed to data. The algorithms need to be exposed to data sets, and that raises all kinds of issues in terms of biases and so on. Mm-hmm. So with that, you've got AI technology, you've got fast computer technology, and you've got big data. And all of that together, from the perspective of an adversary, makes a very lucrative target.
That's right.
And so, and as we go forward with 5G and Internet of Things, and as more and more data is collected, that trove of information is going to be even richer and even more desirable for an adversary to obtain. And most likely that will be done through malicious cyber activities. Mm-hmm. And so I think when I start to think about that, I become depressed because our cybersecurity posture is so grim, quite frankly. And so the incentives for the adversaries to go after those kinds of assets, their abilities, their resources are quite substantial. And that will, we've already seen the erosion of U.S. technical edge, loss of intellectual property, loss of money, those kinds of things that have harmed the country. And so I think the desire for adversaries to obtain that information is even going to be greater, because I think they understand also how revolutionary this technology is. And if they don't keep up with us, sure, they're going to be in a bad way. So they have a substantial incentive to try to steal that kind of stuff.
And we've recently been declared the most cyber vulnerable society on the planet. And so this is a really important issue at this particular moment. Susan, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that whenever we think about sort of the problems we have been unable to solve, systemically insecure software, the ability to sort of bring it up even to minimal standards, this AI starts to sort of pose a really interesting potential solutions in that space, because we have sort of insufficient regulatory frameworks, because That's of the first to market incentives, other things. It might be that trying to build secure software at the front end, we throw up our hands and say that's not possible. What we have seen whenever we actually see these AI tools deployed is the ability of machine learning systems to go out, sort of in capture the flag type simulations, go out, identify vulnerabilities in other systems, learn how to exploit them, come back to their own systems, identify that same vulnerability in themselves, and then patch it, right? So we're seeing now this continuous loop, things that can happen without any human intervention whatsoever. I think what we're heading towards is a system in which then it depends on sort of how asymmetric the broader landscape is. So you're naturally going to have a race in that space as things get hopefully better and better, more and more secure. But it's why I think we're seeing so much anxiety, especially in the United States right now, about our perceived lack of a strategic edge here. Sort of the first to dominate this technology really is going to be able to set a lot of the broader rules. And so some of the early indications that we might be lagging behind, I think that does have really troubling long-term implications, in part because we don't really know where any of this is going to go, and we don't necessarily understand the technology itself.
And I think as we see, to your point, the improvement of dynamic cognitive defensive systems, which in very real sense, given the speeds involved here, where we have cognitive systems who are seeking to breach a network while we have cognitive systems operating against it seeking to defend the network. This is a very intriguing dimension, I think, of the whole business of cybersecurity as it evolves. Now, for those of you who have taken notice, we're doing a lot of writing here at Brookings and a number of public events. We're going to do a lot more in the near future. One of the things that's very important to us here at Brookings, and Jim and Susan, I'll ask you to comment first, and Scott, you can come in behind it, is the whole issue of an acronym which I'm sure for those of you who are familiar with this community are familiar with. It's called ELSI. which stands for the ethical, legal, and societal implications of artificial intelligence and the community of technologies associated with it. It really needs to define much of who we are as a people and what we seek to achieve with respect to the implications and the employment of artificial intelligence. Let me just ask, Jim, in the capacity, both you and Susan, in your long careers within the law and as having been general counsels, what are you thinking about when you hear about those ethical issues, ethical, legal, and societal issues?
All right. So, as general counsel, I was one of the main parts of my job was to worry, and I worried a lot.
That made you a very good general counsel. Thank you.
Yes. So anyway, so I worry a lot about those kinds of things. So I worry about. Let me just highlight two things. One is to make sure, for example, that an agency like the Bureau is, when it's using AI, it's using it in ways that are explainable and ethical and consistent with the constitutional laws of the United States, right? And so to make sure that we're buying products that we understand what's happening. Again, I'm speaking the present, it's the past, but anyway, that the Bureau and other government agencies are buying products that they understand, that they can explain, that they can defend in court, that they can defend to Congress and the American people. And that are consistent with all of our values, right? So that's one of the most important things. Because, well, we don't want to show up in court with bad AI. We don't want to send scarce investigative resources chasing after leads that's based on some type of bad algorithm or bad application of an algorithm because it says these people are the ones that you need to worry about. These are the most likely terrorists, for example. And you devote a lot of resources. What the FBI is limited in terms of how many resources it has. So I worry substantially about that. So the Bureau and other government agencies need to make sure that they have in place, excuse me, mechanisms to make sure that they're buying the best AI. Okay. I do worry significantly about what adversaries will do and whether their values will be the same as ours when it comes to ethical and explainable AI. They may not care that they understand how it works so long as it produces a result that they like. And they may be willing to tolerate sort of, I'll call it collateral damage, damage to people, damage to institutions, damage to innocent individuals, that to their minds is an acceptable cost given the highly beneficial result that they're obtaining from this black box AI that they can't really understand. And I'm concerned that that will put pressure on us to try to keep pace with them. Right. That their AI, even if it has a lot of negative externalities, so to speak, if it's producing something really good for them and they're pushing forward with that, that's going to put pressure on us, and whether we can keep up with that. With our AI. If our AI is explainable and ethical, it's probably going to be better in the long run and will prevail in the long run, but it's going to be, I think, challenging to try to keep up with the adversaries if they're willing to go down this route.
Susan, your thoughts? That's a really important, I'll come back to that, Jim, thank you.
Yeah, so I do think that it's going to pose really tremendous legal challenges, in part because sort of our legal structure is predicated on being able to hold someone accountable for making a decision. And as fewer and fewer human beings actually make decisions, it's going to be more and more difficult. Who can we ultimately hold accountable, right? If you go back to the designer of the system, is it the person who created the training sets? Right. Is it the person who deployed it, who didn't notice compliance mechanisms? Right? We're really going to need to think through, kind of the core framework here of how exactly we're going to regulate and think about law and responsibility in this space. I think in some ways, though, the more difficult or sort of vexing challenge is going to be those broader ethical concerns. And whenever we think about training sets, for example, we know that it's possible to introduce bias, right? So whatever goes in is what comes out. On one hand, that might be a point of vulnerability. Somebody might manipulate training sets intentionally. We might also unintentionally manipulate training sets. So one of the most sort of influential and important AI data training sets is the Enron emails. just these 1.6 million emails that were released by the FERC after the Enron case for transparency reasons. It's a huge free trove of data of human beings talking to each other. It is really invaluable, and so lots and lots of researchers have used it in their work just because it's there. Now, if we step back for a minute and think of the values and the choices and the assumptions about human expectations and behaviors we would want these systems to have, is the behavior of Enron employees in 2000, is that the model that we want to put into these systems? And so we really do, the technology is moving at such an incredibly fast pace that it's difficult to sort of say, hey, let's stop and take a step back and think about what we're doing here. I think ultimately this sort of leads to a need for transparency, right? The need to understand what is going into these systems in order to understand what is coming out of them. That fundamentally is in tension with security, because as people understand these systems more and more, they're going to understand how to manipulate them potentially in negative ways more and more. And so we are going to really need to think through what we care the most about, because there really is a risk here of not only introducing this sort of bias, but formalizing it and hardening it in ways that are going to be really difficult to sort of unwind later.
It's pretty tough. Scott?
A big part of me is a little more optimistic than parts of that. This is a huge challenge in communication of science and technology and its implications. One of the most profound talks I ever heard was one given by Alan Alda at a AAAS meeting some years ago. He's got a center at Stony Brook that specializes in how to communicate science with the public. Mm-hmm. We've all seen TED Talks that are really very insightful. When the edge isn't there, they're just talking about trying to explain it. I remember vividly the testimony of Richard Feynman at the Challenger Commission. We need to find ways to explain what's being tried, how it worked, what didn't work, in a way that makes it simple for people to follow and simply trust the citizenry and our country to do it. And we're a fractious place. Tocqueville talked about that, but there are strengths to that sort of thing. And this is a technology that everybody on the globe is going to be experimenting with. And that's actually going to be a huge strength, because we'll see what works and doesn't work in a European place versus a South American place versus an Asian place or whatever. And then we can sort of draw our conclusions and listen and learn from that. And I think that actually is a significant strength to this technology and our choices in how to employ it.
So Microsoft this week, Google this week, issued a document where it takes a position in that document that none of the work that Google will perform will either support the development of the weaponization of AI for weapon systems or for surveillance purposes. So we're talking about that. We're talking about the ethics of AI, the ethical, the legal, the societal implications. We have a major tech company that has taken a social and policy position with respect to its willingness to participate in AI for the purposes of national security. And then we have the issue of global competition. And I think we know that there will be those who seek to adopt and adapt the algorithms of artificial intelligence with supercomputing and access to big data that may not otherwise be so constrained by ethics as we are. And when, as Susan said early along, as one of the key aspects of this international competition is both speed of development and speed of employment. What are your thoughts about this? Where are we right now as we move into the digital future with respect to these intersecting lines of tech giants being unwilling to participate in national security with respect to AI, the inherent flow of resources and commitment by certain nations to the development of these capabilities? Where do you think we stand? And Scott, let's go back to you, since you're part of the government now.
Absolutely. I think it's still early in this evolution of how this is going to work. I understand the Google statement and position. There is a need for transparency. Again, as somebody steeped in technology, it's a problem for me not to try and experiment, show people what did or didn't work, how it was set up, be able to go back to it later and talk about it in a fairly dispassionate way. And clearly AI, there are huge human systems, social elements to all this, but we still have to try and figure out how to experiment, because the experimentation contributes to the decisions about how to ultimately make it work. And there are lots of companies that are still playing in the space and supporting the government and working with, and the government's still trying to figure out how to run these experiments and where the boundaries ought to be. And the Google statement, I think, contributes to that discussion of, we don't want to just blindly support everything, but we want to think about that. So I think in the end it'll work out pretty solidly, as long as we have an open mind to it, an open technical and purpose mind, and we explain things about why we're trying to do it, and think of them in experimental senses, in demonstration activities, in engineering problems and analysis and things like that, because that's really where we're at in a lot of these cases.
Jim, any thoughts?
Sure. Well, so I think you would definitely know better than I do, but the military implications of AI are vast, and we're not going to be able to cover that right now. But they're profound, they're substantial, and a lot of money is being invested in that in the United States and around the globe. I'm quite confident that there will be, if it's not Google, there will be other contractors that step up and fulfill that role with respect to the U.S. military, the militaries of our allies, and our adversaries as well. And that's the point. I think that we are going to, if companies don't want to deal with or don't want to participate in the production of those kinds of products, I guess I'll call them, our adversaries will, and so the United States will have to figure out how to deal with that. So we're going to have to figure out some way to develop that type of technology to the benefit of our military in a way that's consistent with our values and U.S. policy, because that's the world that we're going to live in.
Thank you. Yep.
That's the main point, I think.
I think so too. Yeah. Susan.
Yeah, so this isn't the first time that we've had to sort of confront the issue of dual-use technologies, and so I think in some ways this is novel, in some ways it's not novel. I can speak less to sort of the weapons element of this, but as a former member of the intelligence community, as we think about sort of the surveillance tools, clearly there is a capacity for harm here. But by whenever large companies decide sort of just not to participate, I think two things end up happening. One, you forfeit the ability to actually shape these technologies, and I think it is an accurate prediction that this doesn't mean these systems aren't going to be built. It means they aren't going to be built by you. And so by sort of as a threshold matter, just saying, hey, we're not going to operate in this space, that might be a reasonable choice to make, but you are giving up the ability to sort of bake in some of your values there. I also think whenever we think about sort of the surveillance context specifically, there's a little bit of an assumption, especially from technology companies right now, to discuss U.S. surveillance and U.S. national security, surveillance for U.S. national security purposes, as sort of necessarily an evil, right? It is not a neutral technology that can be used for both good and evil, but instead it is a bad thing. And I think that is a little bit of a shame, in part because the intention of the U.S. intelligence community is to make the world safer for people and ideas. And I understand that's a controversial position, but that really is supposed to be the core of what we're working towards. One of the core issues that we've had in the U.S. surveillance debate has been discussions about privacy. How do we protect the privacy of Americans and innocent individuals abroad while also allowing them to conduct this sort of critical mission? One tremendous sort of potential use here is the ability to use AI in order to minimize privacy intrusions, right? Have fewer people looking at personal information, ensuring that we are only looking at that which is strictly necessary, right? Mm-hmm. So there actually is a lot of ability to sort of maximize privacy values, potentially sort of that mythical space in which we don't have to give up privacy for security, this thing that we've all sort of been discussing really just aspirationally. This is the technology that potentially starts to move us there in a real way. And so I take the concerns here. I think they're real and they shouldn't be minimized, but I do worry sort of as a threshold matter of just saying, hey, we're not going to allow any systems to be built or used in this way. I worry that we're leaving a lot of good on the table by doing that.
The points that all of you have made, which are very important, is that this is going to be a crucial consideration as we move forward. the whole business of dual use AI algorithms, the improvement of supercomputing, the access to data, the scope of which we can only now begin to imagine, it really forces us to have to come to grips with these whole ethical issues. And that's completely apart from a conversation I don't want to get into today, but it deserves our continued consideration, and that is the whole business of autonomous weapons systems and the capacity of the United States to wield these systems in a hyperwar environment where there is theoretically, no human in the loop. And I'm not talking about a U.S. human in the loop. I'm talking about in the theory of where in the process of autonomous systems, where weapon systems are employed, at an ethical level, is the human in the loop to ensure that we remain true to our values. That's really the pivot point of much of this conversation, and all of you have touched that in one form or another. We have about 25 minutes for questions. What I'd like to do is go out to the audience. As you ask the question, I would ask you to identify yourself, please, and your organization. And within just a couple of seconds after you begin to speak, I'll start looking for a question mark somewhere in your conversation. But let's go ahead and go out to the audience, please, for some Q&A. Yes, sir, please, in the middle aisle.
Thank you very much for this fascinating, eye-opening discussion. My name is Jeff Oblem. I'm a recently retired State Department diplomat, now managing my own consulting firm.
Thank you for your service, by the way.
Thank you for your service, sir. You began to touch on this question, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about it. The question is this: given the vulnerabilities that we face as a government and as a nation to this threat of adversarial weaponized AI, what approach should we be taking as a government on the international level to try to mitigate that risk? For example, is there a role for the UN in trying to help prevent an AI arms race, or for setting international standards or rules about weaponized AI? Should this be a diplomatic priority for us? Thank you.
Who would like to try that?
So I think it's an important question without sort of a clear answer, but I think that as we've seen sort of in other elements of sort of cyber conflict and cyber nation states, eventually whenever you're asking you're asking nations to not do that which they are able to do. And on a pure technological level, we know that they are able or will be able to do it in the near future. You ultimately have to come to some sort of norms agreement. And so wherever we end up, I do think that this ultimately ends up on the international stage, whether or not it's at the UN or sort of other international engagements. That poses a difficult question for the United States, because the way in which you get others to constrain themselves is by being willing to constrain yourself. And so I think that that is why it's so important that we get really, really clear on our values in this space early on, so that we can make decisions to start sort of shaping the international landscape, because ultimately we are going to have to come to some sort of normative agreement about what is acceptable and not acceptable with this technology. And we're going to have to make those decisions in a landscape in which even sort of the best and the brightest minds working on this don't fully understand the technology yet. We're going to have to start making the values decisions. We aren't going to have the luxury of sort of letting it all play out and then making a choice. So ultimately, I do think that there is that international engagement. I don't know that now is the moment, in part because I don't know that anybody knows what that would look like.
Anyone else?
It's happening to some extent already, and it comes out of a history of technology standardization and collaboration worldwide. You know, we've done this for decades. I mean, my colleague Mike and NIST organization, that's one of the big things they do, is figure out how to make things cross-link and practice and details with other countries, because that's what we all come out and gain. And so this will percolate into that space in the same way, and in some ways it probably already is in different parts and shapes and ways.
I'll just add, picking up on what Susan said, the U.S., it seems to me, has a hard time developing national policy on technology issues. And until we have a policy, I don't know what you march in and ask these international bodies to do. So I think that's the work that we should be doing, is just what Susan said, developing our national policy on AI and the rest of the digital ecosystem, as I was talking about before.
And to exactly those points, we have a definitional challenge ahead of us. You used the term weaponized AI. Where does weaponized AI begin? Does it begin when the round comes off the rail of a predator? and the system was entirely autonomous and it identified the target through facial identification and engaged it autonomously? Or does the weaponization of AI begin somewhere well upstream with a surveillance system that identifies key individuals who are later to be prosecuted as targets? So we've got a definitional challenge ahead of us with respect to AI, and that's something that we hope to strap on here at this institution. It's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
Barbara Redmond, New York University Division of Medical Ethics. Just good to have an ethicist around. I'm sure there are many of them. Here's the question. What degree do you think that our social or ethical norms will be shifted as we work through this problem? Shifted from where they are now?
Barbara, can I ask a question? Are you satisfied with where our ethics are now? Could, in your question, our ethics be improved?
Of course.
Okay, good. I wanted to make sure we weren't in a death spiral here. Okay, please.
Well, I guess I would say that ethics, it seems to me, stem from a set of values, and a set of values that we as Americans hold. We want to we are now confronted with a new technology that raises, I think, profound and challenging questions. And what really we need to do is figure out how we apply our ethics in that how we apply our values in that new arena. And I think what's hard is we don't completely have a picture of what that new arena is. We don't really understand exactly what this technology is going to do. It's apparent in some ways, but I don't think the public understands it fully. Companies and other organizations that are dealing with it and employing it and working day in, day out are understanding it more and more as they go through, but that's not necessarily transparent to everyone. So I think a significant issue here will be transparency. Because of the value of these assets, private companies that are developing them are going to guard that intellectual property quite vigorously, I would assume. And so, it may be that the thing is done and finished and ready to be deployed, and there really has been no transparency and nobody really understands what's been going on. So I think that's part of the dilemma. So I think maybe, again, picking up on what Google did, laying out some sort of high-level principles, starting that discussion and that debate with the public, I think is a highly beneficial thing to do. And you can agree or disagree with what their principles are, whether they're sufficient to go far enough in some people's minds. But I think making this a public debate, at least at some high level, where then the people deploying it and thinking about it and working day to day can sort of benefit from that type of thinking. And not to mention the law needs to keep up with all this, and that's I'm depressed about that too. So
that's a real challenge.
Yeah.
Any other from panel? Scott or Susan?
I mean, you're infinitely more qualified to answer your question, I think, or I should kick it over to our colleague Daryl West, who's thought about this more in sort of the medical space. This isn't really an answer, but sort of a shared concern that I think a lot of the way we think about sort of the ethics questions and issues focuses on the process. Do we have a process that has integrity? And then whether or not, and then we can tolerate particular outcomes as long as we're confident in sort of a process with integrity. We're going to have to ask how we think about this whenever we don't necessarily understand the process, and really all we have as sort of as human beings to judge is the outcomes. And so I think that is going to be sort of the shift or the struggle is, how do we even understand what has occurred in a way that we can fix it if we're just constantly sort of being reactive to what has happened as opposed to the system that actually produced the outcome.
That's why I asked you, could you be optimistic about this? And I think we can be quite optimistic in some respects because as we do more big data analytics and predictive analytics, what we've discovered is that many of the databases that we've been working with for years have inherent racial bias and gender bias baked right into them. Wow. And so as we go about the business of employing big data with AI algorithms, we are now, I believe, far more attentive to preventing that from happening, which inherently improves us as a society. And this is, I think, an unintended but very important optimistic outcome in this regard. So, yes, sir, please, just in from the aisle.
Hello, thank you. Jesse Wu, Alita Consulting. So there's been much discussion about transparency and explainability in the algorithms, but I think there's a growing recognition that, especially with deep learning algorithms, which are sort of the most powerful, that transparency, just being able to see the code doesn't really get you, doesn't tell you enough. And so there's talk of like maybe audits or other measures, but what kind of policy frameworks would you suggest be in place to ensure that either audits or transparency or some other measures are in place to control for these bad outcomes, especially in the national security context where just things are more complicated. So.
I'll just jump in on that. I mean, I think that's a great point, and that's my understanding too, that the technology and the mathematics are just moving so quickly that it's very hard for people to really understand it. We may just have a point where humans can't understand it. That's one thing. And the other thing is what I talked about before with the adversary's use of sort of the black box where they don't understand it and they don't care, and they're willing to use it anyway. So I think we as a society, again, back to the earlier question, have to come up with how are we going to think about that? Is that acceptable or not? I don't sit here and have the answer to that, but it may be that the reality is that we just can't understand all of the activities with sort of within the box, and that it actually is black. So I think we just need to have a public debate about that and come up with a set of principles. I'm not sure how you're going to reflect those, perhaps in law, that articulate what it is that's acceptable, at least in the United States. Other countries are going to have to confront the same thing and decide what they're willing to tolerate and how they want to guide their private entities in terms of the developments that they're willing to engage in or allow to happen.
Thanks, Joe. Scott?
I think there's one powerful positive and one troubling or challenging negative from a Homeland perspective, which is how I'm thinking about it right now. The Homeland Security Department in the United States deals with the public every day in all sorts of different places. And it isn't going to take long for the question why provided to a Homeland Security leader somewhere, and you're going to have to explain why something was done, somebody was picked, somebody wasn't, all those sorts of things. And that's a powerful strength of our system is, you answer to the public, you answer democratically, and all that's going to actually help. And we're seeing bits and pieces of that already. The challenge we face, again, in the Homeland perspective, is how do you explain to somebody what didn't happen because of what you did?
That's right.
And it's the old phrase, the dog that didn't bark. And how do you explain that that was a valuable outcome and things like that? And that's a very difficult thing to do in a democracy. But it's actually one of the important parts of the communications challenge. It's not that hard to explain from a physics perspective why the Challenger exploded. It's a whole lot harder to explain the different systems that together collaboratively broke down and then what do you do about it. And I think the 9/11 Commission was an awesome exercise in democratic exploration of things. We don't want to see that happen again and have to go through that drill again, but we have to have that quality of examination and system improvement even without the sparking point, and that's going to be hard to do.
Susan, any thoughts?
I think that this, especially sort of in the national security specific context, which tends to be a context in which there can't be public transparency, one of the challenges is whenever you have the people designing the systems also designing the compliance and auditing mechanisms, whatever they missed in the original system design, they are likely to miss, right? So they're likely to design compliance and auditing systems that confirm the things that they already believe the system should be doing. And so I do think that especially in that space, a challenge is going to be, how do we red team ourselves? How do we build something where we can be really, really confident? That's going to involve diversity of thought, right? And having lots of different people working on shared challenges. That's not something that the United States government has been very good about in the past. It's exacerbated by just sort of the brain drain and challenge of getting really smart people into the government in the first instance. I think one thing we might see is that the private sector is on the cutting edge here. This is going to be where they develop not only the tools, but the compliance control mechanisms. And that's going to be responsive to a regulatory regime. And then we're going to have sort of the legal infrastructure within the government catching up. That's a little bit of the inverse than what we're used to. And I do think it's going to produce problems. The sort of the systemic challenges that led to that place are really, really complex. And so we might just have to sort of, the best we can do might just be to recognize sort of the state of the world and understand how we can operate within it. Because honestly, I don't even know how you would begin to go about solving those problems on the scale and with the speed necessary.
Justin, to your point, the speed of government is much slower than the speed of the private sector's capacity to both develop and deploy the technologies. So to Jim's point, to Scott's, and to Susan's point, we are behind in this process. Now, an area where I think it's very interesting for us to continue this conversation is on the employment of force in the context of the use of artificial intelligence broadly and then very specifically. The law of armed conflict requires that all commanders, before they employ force, have the necessity to employ it, have the capacity to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, and use only enough force to accomplish the mission. Now, that's relatively understandable and explainable and accountable in today's weapon systems by and large. But when we find ourselves in a realm where there is a certain amount of autonomy occurring, and artificial intelligence algorithms are making decisions in order to maintain a speed of conflict, you're no less responsible, but how we determine accountability is going to be very interesting as we go forward with this. This goes back to the definitional challenges that we have and the absolute importance of conversations like this as we go forward. Yes, sir, on the far wall. We have about 10 minutes left.
Toby Harshaw from Bloomberg Opinion. I have a question sort of following up to that one. Let's say hypothetically that the rest of Silicon Valley follows Google's lead here. Who do we turn to? Is the traditional military industrial base capable of understanding this stuff? Could the IC and the Pentagon take it on in-house?
Any thoughts?
I mean, this is a cynical answer, but there are billions and billions of dollars here, and I'm quite confident that the American system will produce a sort of a willing participant to want to design these things. I think one of the problems with potentially decoupling this into sort of the defense industrial base space or sort of separate from the public sector is one, we're going to have more distance from those public sector values. Two, we know that sort of the data and the use of this stuff is commingled. These are likely going to be deployed in civilian spaces or civilian military spaces, and so I have no doubt that there is going to be someone and someone who's quite capable of developing these systems. But I do think that they might be quite different in character and values and the data sets and information that they can use to create their systems. And so if that's going to be sort of the path that we walk down here, we're going to have to think about, all right, how can we correct for essentially this imbalance here and bring in some of those values and insights into this space.
I think what Google's done is actually a very good thing, which is to bring the discussion into the public about, are there limits? How should we even approach the limiting question early in the game? Their position may stay the same. It may change over time. Companies shift and adjust. Everybody's trying to figure out how to make use of this. Everybody's trying to figure out how to help this drive fundamental underlying economic efficiencies and gains and everything else. It'll work its way out, I do believe. Mm-hmm. But their point is a really good one. You can't hide from the ethical questions early in the consideration of how to use things now, because these are inherently ethical in some of the choices. And part of me would want to see some legitimate experiments, pilots, demonstrations to help understand them better, but you also can't go into it blindly. And so I think it'll work its way out when you look at the companies generally and Google as well as the future unfolds.
Yeah, great question, Toby. Thanks. Sure. Microphone, please, because we have the webcast.
I'm just wondering if the other three of you agree with Susan's comment that Google and those companies are missing a chance to actually help shape this in the way that they want it shaped by walking away.
Well, yeah, I don't want to appear to condemn Google's, I think, very clear corporate position to take the moral high ground on an issue. But I do believe that there will be companies believing that they also are similarly armed with a set of values that will move forward with this. But I also know that we have competitors in this world that are not in the least constrained by the values that we as a nation embrace as a matter of our DNA, frankly. And while we've got problems from time to time, in the end, we are a nation of laws and a nation of people committed to the human rights of our population and the human rights of people around the world. That's not the case with all of our potential competitors. And so that's going to be a challenge for us. We have to work our way through this. Again, the speed of government and the speed of this conversation is lagging the potential for the technology. And the technology, frankly, is fearsome in some applications. And we have got to get a grip on this, frankly.
And just to be clear to the point before Jim responds, I don't intend to sort of condemn Google for this. I think it is. I think the fundamental choice is sort of a do no harm principle, right? If you don't understand this fully, making the threshold decision of saying we're not going to operate in this space and then figure out sort of the ethical questions later, I think that's a reasonable choice.
Sure.
It's just necessary that we sort of identify that means the decisions are going to be made by others, and then it's going to be incumbent upon all of us, especially those of us sort of in the policy and government space, to really think about the character and nature of how those decisions are being made.
Yeah, well said.
I was just going to add that I think your question raises an even more profound issue, which is sort of where is the origin of that kind of thinking and the concerns that I have with respect to the relationship between the government and the people. And how are the people thinking about the government such that they would not want to participate, if the premise of your question is true. But we've seen a lot of that, as Susan was alluding to earlier, in terms of over the last several years, the concerns about government surveillance, that kind of thing. I mean, I think that is something that we have to spend a lot more time as a country working on and reflecting on and making progress on together in terms of how we, as a people, relate to our government and our governmental institutions.
Thank you, Toby. Yes, ma'am, please. Microphone coming.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. My name is Ilana Quint from Arizona State University, currently researching cybersecurity with the House of Representatives. And so my question today is that a lot of our discussions about technology seem to be very reactive. And so as someone interested in trying to start conversations for the future, how can we reorient our thinking or our discussions to make our discussions of policy and law more proactive regarding future technology?
I think that's actually happening as we speak. To me, one of the most interesting parts of all this is the collision, the mashup, the combination of different machine learning and AI techniques with the way that they are percolating into just operating technology and management systems nationwide, infrastructure-wide, et cetera, with the question of how do you educate people to use them, adapt them, fold them in, and that's a workforce education from the age of 50 to 65 and beyond. So all of that's happening in different places around the country, again, in different applied experimental use cases, and that, I think, is where we're going to get more anticipatory, more proactive, and less reactive, I think, if you look at things.
Anyone else?
Yeah, so I'd make a plug for the reactive model here. Our legislative bodies tend to not be great in terms of sort of predicting technology. And so whenever we think about the various levers we might have in order to influence the actual development here, I'm not sure that those legislative levers are the appropriate ones. I think that there is sort of a case to be made where we think about how the issues might emerge in the particular and sort of passing particular legislation that allows judges to decide in in particular cases. So obviously we need sort of Congress to get up to speed, on technology issues across the board, but I think the real risks of stymieing innovation, focusing on the wrong issues, having unintended consequences, to me those seems like the more probable risks to be realized. And so sort of until we solve some of those issues, I do think that education mode really is the one that we want to see Congress in, getting them to learn as much as possible, excuse me, and to support education as much as possible, right? Funding these programs, funding initiatives, getting sort of people to be focused on the questions rather than deciding sort of what are the legislative answers.
John, please, Jim. Just real quick. So to be proactive requires leadership. So leaders need to drive change in their organizations in order to accomplish what it is that you're talking about. Technology is hard to understand for everybody and for leaders who didn't grow up with it in the same way that younger folks are. That's number one. Number two is they're busy and distracted by other things. They have other things they have to worry about with respect to their organizations, and it's hard, I think, for them to really appreciate and understand and drive change through the organization. I think that's the reality of it. Another thing is, quite frankly, I've sat through a lot of bad briefings on technology issues where technologists struggle to explain what's happening and what it means to non-technical folks in the organizations. And I think that is something that technologists can work on, trying to figure out how to explain all that. I love this quote. It's been attributed to Einstein, saying that you don't really understand something unless you can explain it to your grandmother. And I think keeping things simple and explaining them in a simple but not simplistic way, so that you can so that leaders can understand the nuances and so on, will help them. So I think it's sort of a two-way street. Leaders need to drive this, and folks thinking about these problems need to figure out how to communicate upstream to make it effective.
Ilana, we've got great confidence in your ability to help our elected representatives to figure this out. And happily, there is an AI caucus now on the Hill, which I think is a very good start. It gets to the point that you've made. And it was actually my grandmother who explained many things to me as I was growing up, so I was very happy for that relationship. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had, I think, a very stimulating panel. We have touched on some, I think, central issues that we're going to have to address as we move forward with the embrace of not just artificial intelligence, but emerging technologies of the 21st century. The speed of development, the speed of innovation, the speed of employment of these kinds of systems is going to have to require, or going to be aided in a very real way, by public policy research institutions to help the technical organizations to bridge the gap with the governmental organizations, so we can have laws and regulations and policies that bring us along as a people consistent with our values as we embrace this technology. Let me ask you to help me thank this great panel this morning, and we'll move on quickly to the next. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.